Good evening, everyone. I am Charlene Edwards, Director of Programs and Events for Project Unity, and I want to thank you for joining us for Project Unity's Listen and Learn speaker series for the month of October. Tonight, I have the special honor to have a conversation with Stephanie Deutsch. Stephanie was born in DC, where she lived for over 50 years, raised three children with her husband, David Deutsch, who is the great grandson of Julius Rosenwald, who is the focus of tonight's Listen and Learn series, Part 1. We will have part two next month, and you'll learn more about that here shortly. Stephanie is the author of the book You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools from the Segregated South, which was published in 2011. The book is about the Rosenwald Schools Initiative, led by Julius Rosenwald, who is a businessman, a philanthropist, and president of Sears Roebuck, which some of us remember Sears. And along with Booker T. Washington, who was an educator of the Tuskegee Institute, author, and a reformer, the two men forged a relationship and partnership to build over 5,000 schools for Black children across the segregated South. Stephanie, help us walk in the shoes of Julius Rosenwald. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to write the book, You Need a Schoolhouse.
Thanks, Charlene. Gosh, what drew me to write the book, You Need a Schoolhouse? Well, like a lot of people who grew up in the 50s, I think, I loved to read biographies, and there were lots of children's biographies back then. And so I read lots and lots of stories of different people's lives. Mostly, I have to admit, focusing on ballet dancers, princesses, saints, female characters. Um, but as in my adult life, after I was raising my children and looking around for ways to stay engaged professionally, I was doing some writing, and I decided I want to write a biography. I like biography. It's a good way to think about history through individuals. And my husband's cousin, you mentioned that my husband is a great grandson of Julius Rosenwald. So one of his cousins said, "Well, what about writing about Julius Rosenwald?"
Hmm.
And I thought, well, I don't know, a businessman, how interesting could that be?
Mhm.
Um, However, as you mentioned, I did know the name Sears, and of course, grew up wearing Sears clothes, poring over the Sears catalog, lusting after all the stuff. And there was one existing biography of Rosenwald. And when I read it, and when I got to the part that talked about his relationship with Booker T. Washington, I really was kind of hooked. And I realized to my embarrassment, really, that although I certainly recognized the name Booker T. Washington, I didn't know very much about him.
Mm.
And I was sort of astonished at my own ignorance, what I didn't know about the background that these schools grew out of. So I started to do research, and it was just kind of good luck that this is about the time that the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the year 2002 named the Rosenwald schools as a group to their list of most endangered historic sites in America.
Wow.
So there was just starting to be a movement to preserve the schools. And so it was kind of good timing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Um, you talked about, or at least I read about your childhood and how you lived in New Zealand, where you went to school in Paris and studied in Russia and Soviet studies. So you've lived, you've traveled, you've studied the history of other countries and foreign countries at that. Why is it important for Americans to study and know our history, especially now in the current state of America?
Yeah, that is a great question, Charlene. I remember when I was working on this book on You Need a Schoolhouse, I said to one of my friends, It's so funny. I went to school in France. I know all this French history. I majored in Soviet studies. I specialized in something very un-American. But this is the first story that really speaks to me. And he
Mm,
said, "Well, that's because you're an American." And I think it's true. This story speaks to me because it's it's part of my lived experience.
yeah,
And I care about it in a way that I didn't really care about the Russian Revolution, important as it was.
right.
Um, this story speaks to me, and this story, much of what I wrote took place 100 years ago, but it's still playing out. We're
Hmm.
still living the fallout from this story,
Right.
and I think I became very aware of that as I was working on it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. How does the Rosenwald schools resonate with many of the issues we're facing today with race relations and immigration and the need for philanthropy?
Oh boy. Well, uh, it's hard to believe that the teaching of history should be something that has become controversial. It's
Hmm.
hard to believe that something as important and natural as teaching and learning your country's history um, it should be controversial. I mean, that just seems like a given that, of course, we'd want to know that. And I think we can all agree that even divided as we are at this moment, and as a country, are some deep divisions. But most Americans, I think, very much want us to move towards the more perfect union which our country was created to be.
Hmm.
And I think most people want to move beyond without at all diminishing, dismissing as invalid or unimportant, but we want to move beyond our terrible history of racial prejudice and injustice.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that was really powerful for me was to realize how little I actually knew. And
Hmm.
it was kind of uh, sobering to think, well, I'm well educated. I know this stuff. Well, no, I didn't know this stuff. I didn't.
Hmm.
And it was an example to me of how history can be forgotten.
Hmm.
I mean, when I was going to junior high school in Arlington, Virginia, I studied American history. I never heard the name Frederick Douglass.
Mm.
I never heard of Frederick Douglass till I was an adult.
Hmm. Wow.
Um, so studying this story was helped me understand how history can be forgotten, but how it can also resurface and take on new life. I mean,
Hmm.
Julius Rosenwald was so well known that in 1932, when he died, it was front page news all across the country. Rosenwald dead, nation mourns him. It said
Wow.
on the front of the above the fold in the New York Times. And yet, my my own husband, who was his great grandson, as you mentioned, grew up not knowing anything about it.
Hmm.
No one had heard of Julius Rosenwald.
Hmm.
So I think it's an interesting example of how history needs to be continuously retold and continuously explored. And it's not just one static thing that gets set for all time. We're constantly thinking about it, talking about it, finding out more. Um, and this story is a just really good example of that.
Hmm. Thank you. Tell us about the Rosenwald schools. Like, where are some located? Tell us about his philosophy behind the schools. I guess I'm going to ask you like throw all these questions
Okay,
at you.
okay. Let's go back to Rosenwald. Let's
Okay, absolutely.
let's start with him.
Okay.
Um, so who was Julius Rosenwald? How did he get into this? Um, Julius Rosenwald was a child of German immigrants who came to this country for the reason that immigrants came and still come. They wanted more opportunity, they wanted relief from poverty. And as Jews, his parents also wanted freedom from the anti-Semitism that limited and had limited for hundreds of years the lives of Jews in Europe, where they
Hmm.
couldn't own land, they couldn't attend universities, the professions were closed to them. So Julius's parents came to this country. They came separately. His mother came first, and her brothers were successful businessmen in Baltimore. His father came next, and he followed kind of a classic route. He was a peddler. He worked as a peddler. And then he had the good fortune to meet and marry Julius Rosenwald's mother, Augusta.
Mm.
And her brothers were successful businessmen. And so, as a wedding present to this young couple, they gave them a store to manage.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, a clothing store. So, when Julius was born in August of 1862, his parents were living in Springfield, Illinois. And Julius grew up in a house that actually is right across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. It's Abraham Lincoln wasn't there when he was growing up, but one of his uncles knew him. Lincoln had been a customer at the store. And so Julius grew up working in his father's shop on Saturdays, learning the principles of Judaism. There was a very small temple in Springfield. His father was the first president of it. He had a bar mitzvah. So he learned about Judaism. And he never graduated from high school. When he was 16, his parents sent him to New York to be apprenticed to his uncles who had moved from retail to wholesale and manufacturing. So they were the rag trade. This is the big business of the time. And
Hmm.
Julius is learning that business in New York. His brother came and was learning it with him. And they decided to go out on their own and start their own business, and not to do it in New York, where they'd be in competition with their uncles, but to do it in Chicago, which was the sort of boom town of the time.
Right.
His parents came up from Springfield and came to Chicago too. And Julius and his brother started a company to sell men's clothing. And in 1895, he had an opportunity which worked out really well for him. He had the chance to buy into a small, unknown mail order company called Sears Roebuck.
Hmm.
And Julius later said that it was the work of 5 minutes for him to say, yeah, this is a business with a future.
Hmm.
And, mail order, to understand what mail order was, we kind of can think back to what the internet was when first we realized, oh, I can sit at my desk and order a pair of shoes. Mail order was like that for people. Lots of rural people was an opportunity to buy things that they didn't have in their local stores. It was also popular with African Americans who didn't have to face the condescension, the limited opportunities for shopping that they sometimes had.
Hmm.
And so obviously the choice to buy into Sears Roebuck was a very, very good one. And one of the things that Julius brought to the company, the man who had founded Sears Roebuck, Richard Sears, was a brilliant advertiser, very imaginative entrepreneur, but he was kind of overwhelmed with his own success. The orders started pouring in, and oh my gosh, how is he going to get the stuff delivered? Well, Julius was the opposite. Julius was a brilliant manager.
Hmm.
And so he quickly worked to make things work better. And in 1906, he and Sears decided that they needed a larger facility. They needed a big plant.
Hmm.
And Sears put Julius in charge of building this plant. And it was on the west side of Chicago. And Julius consulted someone he had met when he was a apprentice in New York, named Harry Goldman, who went on to become half of Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs.
And Harry Goldman said, let's not finance this with a loan. Let's sell shares. And so this became one of the first IPOs, initial public offerings in American business history. And so
Mhm.
suddenly Julius was like really, really rich. He had not grown up poverty stricken. I mean, he grew up middle class, but suddenly he was
Mhm.
way richer than he ever thought he'd be. And so he did a lot of the things we might do if we found ourselves in that situation. He bought a big house. By then, he was married to a woman who was also a daughter of Jewish immigrants from Germany, and he had 5 children. So he bought a big house, and he took a trip to Europe. Gussie, his wife, stayed home with the kids, but Julius went to Europe, went to Germany, to the town where he had still had relatives. Um, but he also started to think really seriously about philanthropy because this was very much part of his Jewish heritage. And it was very much part of the Jewish teaching. If you have more than you need, it's your responsibility to give to help others.
Right.
And you give in a way that empowers others. And this is not charity given out of the kindness of your heart. This is given out of a sense of righteousness. This is
Right.
tzedakah. This is given because you have more than you need. And if you have more than you need, it's your responsibility to use it to help others.
Hmm.
And Julius really took that seriously. It was reported that as a young man, he had said that the goal of his life was to have an income of $15,000, $5,000 to live on, $5,000 to save, and $5,000 to give away.
Hmm.
And so he found himself in his 40s. That dream has been way more than realized. And so he started thinking about philanthropy. And he started with Jewish philanthropy organizations in Chicago to help Jewish immigrants. And at one point, he was asked to donate to a YMCA, a
Hmm.
Young Men's Christian Association. And he said, well, I'll leave that to my Christian brothers. Um,
Yeah.
but if you decide to do a YMCA for Black people, Negroes, as they were called
Hmm.
then,
Hmm.
come back and see me again. And YMCAs were really important at this time when people were moving from the country to find jobs in cities, and African Americans had very limited social opportunities, very limited living opportunities. And so a Y for African Americans was really a needed thing. And so the Y leadership lost no time in coming back to Julius and saying, okay, well, how about it? And I love the description of this. He totally astounded the guys who came to his office to ask him to give money for a YMCA for Black people. He said, yes, I'll give for one in Chicago. Actually, I'll give $25,000 to any city in the country that
Hmm.
can raise $75,000 for a YMCA for African Americans. And ultimately, 27 cities accepted that challenge. One was Washington, D.C., which had the first one. One was Dallas,
Hmm.
and built YMCAs for African Americans. And it was a hugely big deal. Um, so it's interesting to consider, why did he become interested in helping African Americans? I mean, what was that?
Right. Right.
He didn't know many Black people. He lived in Chicago, but I think several things pointed him in that direction. One was that the time when Julius was becoming interested in helping African Americans was just at the same time that he, as a Jew, and as many American Jews, was giving money to help European victims of pogroms. There are these terrible riots in Europe. Cities are, Jewish communities are being harassed, more than harassed, and American Jews are giving money to help them. And Julius had a real sense of solidarity. As he said, as part of a persecuted minority, I identify with African Americans.
Hmm.
My people, my people have suffered that. He hadn't personally suffered a lot of prejudice or anything like the pogroms, but he knew about it. He understood it. It was part of his heritage.
Hmm.
Um, and he also knew that in 1908, there was a major race riot in Springfield, Illinois, in his hometown. And he wasn't there then. He was living in Chicago, but it was on the front page of the Chicago paper for 3 straight days, and people were killed.
Hmm.
And he really had a sense of, this is sort of a ghastly story that I'm kind of familiar with repeating itself.
Hmm.
And then to just sort of to further his interest, one of his friends, Paul Sachs, the other half of the Goldman Sachs collaboration, gave him a copy of Up from Slavery.
Hmm.
And so Julius read it, and so became familiar through the book with Booker T. Washington. So when an opportunity to meet Washington came up, Washington was coming to Chicago for a YMCA anniversary dinner. And so Julia said, yes, I would like to meet him. And he hosted a luncheon in Washington's honor, introduced him to a lot of people. And then um, the next day took him to visit the Sears plant.
Hmm.
And took him around, took him to dinner or to lunch in the executive dining room. And I found this image of these two men walking around the Sears campus so sort of provocative. I can almost still remember the exact moment that I was sort of thinking about this and thinking, well, gosh, what was this like?
Hmm.
What was this like? He did say in a letter to someone that there had never been a Black person in the executive dining room before,
Mm-hmm.
and but they had lunch there, and Julius kind of showed off his, Sears, this huge plant. So Booker T. Washington said, "Okay, now I want you to come down to Tuskegee, and I want you to see my place that I've created." And so in October of 1911, Julius fills a private railroad car with his brother, Morris, his friend, Jane Addams. He and his wife were very good friends with Jane Addams, who had founded Hull House for immigrants, a couple of their children, and all these people. And they go down and they spend 3 days on the campus of Tuskegee,
Wow.
which I expect there are people tuned into this talk who have been to Tuskegee and know it is a beautiful campus that had been built, much of it by the students, beautiful sort of rust-colored red bricks. Um, Julius and Gussie and their group spent 3 days there. And at the end of the 3 days, Julius said yes, he agreed that he would join the board of Tuskegee.
Wow.
And yeah, so from that point on, he was very committed to Tuskegee and committed to Booker T. Washington and to what he was doing. And they started corresponding. Of course, there was no email or telephone back then, but they started corresponding. And I loved the looking through some of their letters in the archives, because there was all kinds of back and forth. And one of the letters Julius sent actually Julius's secretary sent a letter to Booker T. Washington, and he said, Mr. Rosenwald wants to start a library with books about Negroes.
Mm-hmm.
Could you recommend some books? So Booker T. Washington wrote right back with a long list of books. He recommended W.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks.
Hmm.
Um, he recommended his own Up from Slavery, although of course Julius had already read that. But they kind of had that kind of back and forth relationship,
Hmm.
and it was interesting to me to see these two men who were actually kind of similar type people. They were both really pragmatic. They weren't, they weren't misty-eyed dreamers. They weren't philosophers. They were guys who were like, let's get it done.
Right.
We, we there needs to be a school to train Black teachers. I mean, Booker T. Washington was only 25 when he went down to Tuskegee and founded that school, which became one of the largest educational institutions in the South. Julius Rosenwald, let's get those orders delivered on time. Let's figure out a way to do it. They were practical. They were very, very pragmatic,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they kind of appreciated that about each other. Um, do you want to jump in with a question, or I can keep going? I
No,
can keep
just
going
just
with the
keep
story.
keep going
Okay,
with, so where does this turn to the schools?
the
Like,
schools. Okay,
mm-hmm.
so in 1912, right after he meets um, Booker T. Washington, Julius turns 50, and he decides to celebrate by giving away $600,000, which was more money then than it is now. And 25,000 of that he gave to Tuskegee.
Hmm.
And so, because he's now on the board, and so Washington says to him, how about if we take just a small portion of this, $2,800 from your gift to Tuskegee, and use it to help 6 communities right around Tuskegee that want to build schools. And Washington explained to to Julius that in the rural South, there were lots of places where there were no schools for white kids, but there were almost no places where there were schools for Black kids.
Right.
Um, Public education was mandatory throughout the South, but the states divided their dollars very unevenly. didn't give anywhere near as much to and there were just very, very few Black schools. And so Washington told Rosenwald that in these communities, the people there who have almost nothing. I mean, these are sharecroppers, these are farmers, these are people who have very little, but they are extremely committed to providing education for their children.
Mm-hmm.
And they're raising money. They're already working to raise money. They want to do this. And this was a very powerful message for Julius because it fit very much in with his own philosophy of you don't give a man, if you give a man a fish, you serve him for a day, but if you teach him to fish, you feed him for his lifetime.
Forever, yeah.
And so this really appealed to him. So they started with six communities right around Tuskegee, and they gave them $300 each. I mean, it just seems like nothing. And the communities raised $300, and they built these six schools. And this is reminding me of a story I love from my research, which is that when I started doing my research, I was able to interview Julius Rosenwald's youngest child, his son William, who was, by the time I interviewed him, he was in his 90s.
Oh, wow.
He was a very, very gracious man, referred to in the family as Uncle Bill. And he agreed to see me. And he told me that he remembered when he was a 9-year-old boy and Booker T. Washington came as a house guest to the Rosenwald's home. And I said, oh my gosh, well, what was that like? And he said, well, I didn't really think that much about Washington. I didn't really know anything about him. I didn't think anything about him. But I did wonder why he and my father spent such a long time in my father's office with the door closed.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this image of this little kid standing outside the door. And then I thought to myself, I bet I know at least part of what they were talking about in there. Washington was explaining, we need schools. We don't have schools. Nobody, we've been deprived education for generations. And now we want it. Now we're committed to it. We want to get it. And people in these communities who have almost nothing
Mm-hmm.
are raising money to build schools. And that really spoke to Julius Rosenwald. That really, I think that was the key to his involvement. He wasn't going to give schools. He was going to work with communities to provide the schools. And so those first six were successful. And when it got publicized, both Washington and Rosenwald, their offices were just swamped with mail from people from all over saying, oh, we're working to build a school. Could we have one? Can you come look at my place? We need a school. And so they agreed to build about 100 more. And again, and people from Tuskegee went out and looked at the schools and helped with the community fundraising. And then Washington, one of his major contributions was all this, was he understood life in the South. He understood government. And so he engineered buy-in from the public school systems. He didn't want to found a whole bunch of private schools that would have to be supported for the rest of their lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
He knew that education was mandatory. The public school systems had a responsibility to educate African American children. And he could make it appealing to them by saying, okay, I got this rich guy up in Chicago who's going to pay part of it. And so so it becomes a three-way partnership. The communities raise money, Rosenwald gives money, and the local governments give money.
Mm-hmm.
So that by the time Booker T. Washington died in 1915, he died kind of young.
Mm-hmm.
And but by that time, the system was well established as a three-way partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, tons of interest from people in building more schools. In fact, there was so much interest that it was way more than the staff at Tuskegee could handle. And Rosenwald, for various reasons that I can come back to, decided to create an office specially dedicated to building the schools. And he put it in Nashville, Tennessee, and he hired a guy named Samuel Smith, who had been the Tennessee agent for Negro schools. That was an office in many state governments. to supervise the building of schools and to be just dedicated 100% to building schools.
Right.
And so between then and 1932, when the program ended, they built close to 5,000 schools.
Wow.
It's just a remarkable. Sometimes when I'm talking to school kids, I'll say, well, how many schools do you think they built? And they'll say 100 or 200. No, 5,000.
Hmm.
And so by the time the goal had been to have at least one Rosenwald school in every county that had significant African American people. And by the time the system closed, they had pretty much achieved that.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah, it's a remarkable story. The other thing that's remarkable, I love this fact. So the public school systems became the largest financial donor by far, but it was the African American communities that gave dollar for dollar more than Julius Rosenwald.
Hmm.
Not a whole lot more, but it was more. And they also, I mean, this is another detail that I love. Um, at the time this is all happening, the Sears Roebuck catalog, you might remember this, you could buy a house from Sears. I mean, they had a whole catalog of different houses.
Hmm.
So at some point, Julius said to Booker T. Washington, well, could we use the Sears houses? Could we make the schools out of these Sears houses? Could we maybe make a kit school? And Booker T. Washington said, well, no, because part of the appeal of this program is the people in the communities, they're going to donate land, they're going to donate materials, they're going to help build the schools. They're going to be donating. They don't have any money, but they're going to donate their labor. And so the schools were a real community project. And I loved the fact that Washington and Rosenwald had the kind of relationship where they could discuss things. And Rosenwald would listen to Booker T. Washington and say, okay, Sears will provide the paint and the doorknobs and things like that. But a lot of the labor was done by people in the communities.
Community.
And that in turn helped increase the incredible affection that in many places was felt by the communities for these schools.
Hmm.
Because
And I can imagine just a sense of pride,
yeah,
right? Being
absolute
able to, yeah.
huge pride and huge, in many places, these small rural areas, there were big families. And so, the one member had donated some of the land, and I talked to a woman who, when she started at the Rosenwald School, her family had given the land. She started at the school in 1927. The teacher was her big sister. And, they were very family. A lot of the schools had many, many members of the family and just a strong connection to the community. Um, so it was an amazing, an amazing program.
Absolutely. And didn't some, if I remember from the, because this stemmed from the exhibition that the Holocaust Museum hosted, what, a month or two, probably about 2 months ago,
Yeah.
um, the Rosenwald exhibition. And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't even some of the families in the area, like, they would also help like farm and give food for,
Oh
like,
yeah.
they would contribute in different ways, right? So there was the labor to build and the land, but there was also, like, there needs to be the school cook,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Oh
food.
yeah. I have in my kitchen downstairs, I have a tin tray from a Rosenwald school in Texas, Pleasant Hill Rosenwald School in Linden, Texas. And I visited there and they gave me this tray. And the woman who handed it to me, her mother was the cook at the school.
Wow.
And they ate their lunch off this tray. It's hanging in my kitchen. It's been in the Smithsonian, but now it's back in my kitchen where I look at it every day. Yeah, the feeling of community that these schools had was a really powerful part of it. One of the things that happened in a lot of places was these were rural schools. The teacher would lodge during the week with one of the families because
Mm.
she'd maybe go back to the town where she lived, but she'd come out and spend the week at the school.
Hmm.
Um, And so there, it's very powerful feeling of community from the schools.
Yeah. Interesting that housing for teachers was even started back then, you know?
Yeah. Well, and actually, of the 5,000 schools, there were also shop buildings and teachers' homes. And there were places where they built a house for teachers. And one or two, or in some places, one place I visited, there were like four teachers who lived there.
Hmm.
Um, because it was, and one of the things that I found really interesting is that the teachers of that era, the Black teachers of that era, teaching was a calling.
Hmm.
Teaching was a sacred mission. They were so dedicated. They wanted so much for the next generation of children to have what they and their forebears had been denied.
Hmm.
And so there were lots of Rosenwald schools where the same teacher was there for 30 years. They
Hmm.
and everyone, generations had her. And when I talk to alumni of Rosenwald schools, one of the things that almost always comes up, oh, the teacher. The teacher was so wonderful.
Hmm.
I still remember Miss Brooks, Miss this, Miss that. The teachers were very uh, revered parts of the community, and they were really dedicated. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to be, this is great. I'm walking with you in my head and I'm envisioning them behind the door having this conversation and this young child at the door trying to peer in and we're
Isn't that
listening.
a isn't that
Yeah.
a powerful image?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, here's a question for you as we prepare to go into Q&A. So if anyone has a question for Stephanie, please go ahead and pop it in the chat right now. Um, Based on what you know about Rosenwald, what would he say today about the current state of educational equity across the U.S.? How could access to education look differently if he was here to have a say, in what this looks like right now?
Well, that is an interesting question, and I don't know. Obviously, I don't know exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say that one thing that was very typical of Rosenwald's philanthropy was he didn't think of himself as the idea guy. He thought of his work as empowering others.
Hmm.
So that when the guy who was the president of the Rosenwald Fund for 20 years, Edwin Embry, when he wrote a book about the fund, the name of the book was Investment in People.
Hmm.
And I think that was so profoundly true of Rosenwald's philanthropy. He invested in people. He invested in children by giving them educational opportunity. And then I haven't even talked about, the Rosenwald Fund also funded fellowships to men and women in various fields. And this program went on after Rosenwald died, but with his money and with his instinct from 1928 to 1948, they funded about 1,000 fellowships, which went to all kinds of different people, but many people who became stellar in their fields. Um, Langston Hughes, Jacob Lawrence, Ralph Bunche, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950, just and many educators, many people in the field of education.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, Rosenwald might, rather than having an opinion himself on what should happen in schools or how we can, he would consider his contribution to solving that problem was by empowering others to solve that problem. You know, looking to those who whose expertise was in that area.
Hmm.
I, when I was asked that question several years ago, I said I thought that possibly charter schools was something in some way similar to Rosenwald schools, in that there was a lot of input from parents as to what they wanted. I know that's tremendously controversial, and I actually, on one occasion, thought that the audience was going to rise up against me because they didn't like that answer. Um, I don't know. I don't know what he'd say if he were here, but I do think he'd look to the people, the experts around him to solve the problem, and he
Hmm.
would be trying to help them. help
Hmm.
them solve the problem.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. Hearing how he consulted with Booker T and brought him to the table, I can imagine that he probably would gather folks who
Yeah.
have different expertise and saying, "Okay, let's talk about this. Let's figure this out together." Right?
He was very aware of the fact that he himself was not an educated man. I mean, Booker T actually had more education than he did. He left
Hmm.
school when he was 16,
Hmm.
but he was very much a lifelong learner and very much someone who, read and enjoyed meeting people and talking to people and learning about different things. But I don't think he certainly was not someone who had an overly taken with his own expertise. He wasn't conceited.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I remember the Sears book. I remember my mom, we going to Sears as a child. I remember the books, the catalogs and sitting
Oh,
and
it was so
getting,
thick like this.
yes, and folding the pages back for things I wished for, at
The
Christmas.
wish book.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And the candy stations that the Sears would have here in Dallas, if there's anyone in Dallas, the Sears building off of on South Side Lamar, which is now the an apartment living area. I remember going down there as a child. With my mom.
Julius always called Sears the store.
The
He
store.
referred to his office as the store. And one of the things I sort of found amusing about him was he was very thrifty. Julius was not extravagant at all. I mean, he was a very,
Mhm.
very wealthy man, but he was very thrifty. And so I read one of the files I read was letters he sent to his son Lessing when Lessing was at college. And in one of the letters, he said to him, Lessing had a guitar. And Julius writes to his son and said, Lessing, you paid $5 for guitar strings when you could have ordered them for Sears for $2. What are you doing? You're being extravagant. And actually, the other example of that really made me laugh was when he took that trip to Europe and he left his wife home with the kids. In one of his letters home, he said, I found in Belgium, I found the lace bedspreads that you liked. But I found out that with duty on them when they came into the country, they'd cost $250 each, and I didn't think you'd want me to spend that much. I read that letter and I said, Julius, you are so wrong. She did want you to spend that much.
She
She
did.
wanted those bedspreads. She was home with the kids, and you were in Europe.
Yeah,
But he was
absolutely.
very thrifty.
Awesome. Thank you for walking us through that story of him and his relationship with Booker T. Washington and the schools. I want to go ahead and jump into questions for the sake of
Okay.
time. Um, Thanks, Stephanie. Dr. Washington and Mr. Rosenwald both lived during biases of the times, a Black educator in the Jim Crow South and Jewish. Let me try to get to this question here. Um, Hold on. Let me go back, Stephanie. I'm so sorry. It's a very
That's all
long
right.
question. Didn't have a chance to digest it a little bit. Um, and a Jewish businessman navigating social prejudice. Did they ever openly discuss or acknowledge those shared barriers or bias and exclusions that you're aware of?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what they might have talked about,
Mm-hmm.
um, how personal they got with all that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I do know that Washington was a house guest in Rosenwald's home.
Mm-hmm.
And I really found this a touching detail. I saw a letter that Washington wrote to Julius and his wife, thanking them for having him in their home. And at the end of the letter, he said, I'm returning your house key, which I thoughtlessly walked away with. And to me, I found that sort of a touching detail that they gave him a key to their house.
Wow.
And he was sending it back. How much they talked about their shared experience, I don't know. I mean, obviously, Washington had way more experience of prejudice and racial discrimination than Julius. Julius used to say in speeches, I can't be admitted to the university club because he
Mhm.
was Jewish. And he said, also, I never went to university, so I couldn't be admitted anyway. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, he made light of it. Uh, as I said earlier, I think that that feeling of solidarity, of being part of a minority group where
Mhm.
you have to join together. That's why Jews were so focused on community, because they lived in Europe, especially, they lived in a very hostile environment. They had to stick together to
Mhm.
help each other, and blacks had the same thing. They stuck together, they helped each other because they knew that they were facing the same barriers and discrimination in the outside world. They had to help
Mhm.
each other. And I
Absolutely.
think there was a real feeling of solidarity about
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, thank
Um,
you. Next question. Are any of these schools still in operation today? Please share.
yes. Now, most of them, so the schools, they're black schools. So when segregation ends, the schools close. Now, segregation didn't end the day Brown versus Board was signed, but
Mhm.
over the next 10, 15, 20 years, the schools closed for the most part. There are a few that are still functioning as schools. One is Dunbar. It's now a high school uh, in in Little
Okay.
Rock.
Little
Little
Rock.
Rock. It's the school that at least one of the Little Rock, the children, the teenagers who integrated
Little Rock.
Central High in Little Rock went to Dunbar, and it's
Okay.
still a school. It was then a junior high school, and now it's a high school.
Mhm.
There's one in Texas. It's funny, I'm blanking on which town it's in, but there's a school that was a school then that's still a school in Texas. I spoke there.
Mhm.
Um, but most of the schools, no, they didn't remain schools. Lots and lots of places they were just kind of boarded up. In some places they were sold and they became businesses or homes, and in some places they were in such rural areas that they just kind of fell apart and disintegrated and no one knows what happened to them.
Mhm.
Um, but most of them did not remain schools because they were small. For the most part, they were small, and a consolidated school was going to be put in the larger, probably better equipped white school.
Mhm.
I do know there's a school in Rappahannock County, Virginia, the first Rosenwald school I visited, um, for 1 year functioned as an integrated school, and then was closed, and the kids all went to the consolidated school. So most of them did not remain as schools.
Mhm. Okay.
Winston-Salem, that's the one in North Carolina, not Texas. North Carolina, Winston-Salem.
Okay. Here's another question. Are there any other underrated historical figures the public should learn more about? In other words, is there anyone else who you'd love to write a biography about?
Ooh, what a lovely question. Um, there are undoubtedly many, many, many figures who one could write about.
Mhm.
And this isn't exactly answering your question, but
Sure.
one thing that I always say when I talk to uh, school kids, especially high school kids, is if you are lucky enough to have a grandmother, a grandfather, a great aunt, a great uncle, interview them, find out
Mhm.
about their lives, because there are probably some great stories there. They may not be famous, but they lived a lot of history that you only know about. And yes, there's much history to be uncovered. There are many stories that need to be told. Is there anyone else I want to write a biography of? I'm actually trying to write a memoir of my own life, which is kind of like
Oh.
writing my biography. Just because I think that it's easy for children, especially while their parents are alive, to sort of tune them out. And then the minute they're gone, they'll go, wait a minute, what did mom, what was she saying?
Mhm.
Where did she go to school? I can't remember.
Mhm.
So I do think recording our own lives, and if we have access to older people who lived through different things, really important, really important to interview them if you possibly can. I'll give you a wonderful example. I was interviewing my daughter's husband's mother. And she had an interesting story. She was an immigrant from Lebanon and became a linguist and, oh, interesting woman. And her son was named Martin. And I said to her, Dora, why did you name your son Martin? And she said, well, he was born in 1968. I named him after Martin Luther King.
Hmm.
And I turned to Martin and I said, did you know that? And he said, no. So there's lots to be learned by talking to the people around us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. Here's another question. Did Mr. Rosenwald also work with Mary McLeod Bethune or St. Catherine Drexel in building Black schools?
Hmm. No, Rosenwald died in 1932.
Hmm.
So he never encountered Mary McLeod Bethune, and I don't think Drexel, what was that name again?
Catherine Drexel.
Catherine Drexel. I'm not very familiar with that story, but no, he did not. He his program was his own.
Hmm. Absolutely. Okay. So you visited a lot of the or several schools.
Lots,
Is
lots.
there one that sticks out to you and why?
Oh, well, I always say that we don't have favorite children. And we don't have, so I shouldn't have favorite Rosenwald schools, but of course I do have a couple of favorites.
Mhm.
And one is the Scrabble School. That was the first Rosenwald school I ever visited because it's in Rappahannock County. I live in DC. It's near where I live. And another that's near where I live is Second Union Rosenwald School in Goochland County, Virginia,
Mhm.
because I've visited there several times and feel a special connection with the people there. They've invited me back on several occasions. It was one of the first schools I visited, and I remember that I went with my husband's cousin who lived nearby, and the school was just kind of open. And there on the desk was a wonderful brass school bell.
Mhm.
Back before electricity, if you wanted to get the kids' attention, you rang an actual bell. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, someone could just walk off with that. Well, by the time I came back to the school the next time, it was being restored and the bell was protected.
Mm.
Um, uh, but I also, Pleasant Hill School in Texas is one of my favorites because the women who there is a group of women who meet in that school once a week. They make quilts,
Yes.
the Pleasant, well, they were at the,
They
they
were
were at
at
the
the
program. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And I was so touched that they all came to the program. There were like 8 of them.
Hmm.
And so that's one of my favorite schools. Um, gosh, honestly, I love them all. I
Hmm.
I feel a real gosh, I'll tell you about one I visited that brought tears to my eyes. This was in Sadieville, Kentucky. And I went on a day that was in March, and there had been a snowstorm.
Hmm.
And so I went to the school, and Sadieville is a small town, and the mayor of the town was there to meet me and show me around the school. And I walked in, and it was just absolutely freezing. Um, and I was just and the school has been restored, but it's not gussied up. It looks very much the way it would have looked when the kids were going to school there.
Hmm.
And I just was overcome. I got tears in my eyes thinking about it was cold like this when the kids came, and this is what the school looked like. And it's a one-room
One
schoolhouse.
room school. Hmm.
And I almost felt like I was there with them.
Hmm.
It was just a powerful feeling. Another favorite school is Ridgely School, which is 25 minutes from my house in Washington, D.C. It's in Maryland.
Hmm.
And that's the school where I was able to meet Mrs. Gray, whose grandmother had given the land for the school. Mrs. Gray started the school in first grade in 1927, came back as a teacher, came back as a principal. Her daughter went to the school. And by the time I knew Mrs. Gray, she was very old.
Hmm.
Um, but it was just thrilling to feel that connection with the school. And it's a beautiful, nicely restored school with a lot
Yeah.
of desks. They have a whole room full of desks from the
Yeah.
school.
I remember from the exhibition in reading how, the windows were designed so that it let in light, but then it was also, they could open them, I think, for air,
Yeah.
and then, they would sometimes have just like the one stove. So they were
Mhm.
all designed to be able to provide light, air conditioning, quote
Yeah.
unquote,
Probably
Talk
got pretty
about what
hot in
went
some.
into the design of those schools.
Yeah. Um, there's a wonderful documentary about Rosenwald schools that some of you may have seen, and in it they interview someone who says the design of the Rosenwald schools was like green architecture, but 100 years ago, because they put a big emphasis on orienting the schools so the light would come in. I think to fall across the shoulder, of course, it was all for right-handed kids. Didn't work so well for the left-handed kids, but and the big tall windows. So there's no electricity, but there was a ton of light because these windows were huge. Um, and yes, there was a pot-bellied stove, and at lots of the schools, one of the things the kids were asked to do was they brought sticks that they picked up on the way to school, and the boys would arrive early to help the teacher get the uh, pot-bellied stove warmed up, get the room warmed up. And yeah,
Very interesting. A lot of history, just a
a
lot.
lot of history and a lot of beautiful. The thing that I think im- I keep coming back to is that I've now talked to a lot of people who went to these schools. They all have positive memories of them.
Hmm.
They all talk about what a positive environment it was. The teachers were Black, and as I said, the teachers were committed. These were women who were extremely, for the most part, women. There were a
Hmm.
few men, but extremely dedicated to what they were doing. Um, the communities were involved. At the Scrabble school, one of their traditions was Friday was always soup day. So one of the parents in the community would bring a huge pot, and everyone would have soup
Hmm.
that someone had brought from home. Um, they all knew each other. It was small. The other thing that's sort of interesting is that the schools were elementary schools, but they had kids of different ages.
Hmm.
And so the first graders are overhearing the third graders' math lessons. And, it's kind of like now that's considered sort of progressive Montessori philosophy that you put different ages together. In Rosenwald schools, it was just practical. That's
Yeah.
what they did because
Yeah.
that's what worked.
Yeah.
And I talked to one gentleman who went to a school in Florida, and he said his mother worked at the school. So he went before he was old enough to go to school. He just went because his mother needed him to do something. So he heard the lesson. He started learning early because he was just there. He was in
Yeah.
the school
Yeah.
overhearing the lessons.
Absolutely. Well, Stephanie, how quickly time flies. There is just one more question I want to read. If you could answer it briefly, and then we'll come to a close.
Okay.
I grew up in Tuskegee and remember a community called Rosenwald Heights. I assume it's in recognition of Mr. Rosenwald. Are you familiar?
I assume so. And of course, Rosenwald visited Tuskegee many, many times. I don't know about Rosenwald Heights.
Hmm.
I'll have to do some. I know about other neighborhoods called Rosenwald. There's one outside of Brevard, North Carolina, a neighborhood called Rosenwald. But I don't know about Rosenwald Heights in Tuskegee. I'll have to look for that. Because Rosenwald certainly visited there many times. And there is one building on the Tuskegee campus that I think is called Rosenwald Hall.
Okay.
Um, but I don't know about Rosenwald Heights. That gives me something I need to look at,
Something else to do. All right.
something else to do.
Absolutely. So I'd like for you to just leave us just with a brief parting call to action or thought or perspective, briefly, as it is now 7 o'clock. What do you want to leave us with a word about Mr. Rosenwald and his effort, just briefly?
Um, what I want to leave you with is hope,
Hmm.
because this is a sort of fraught time in our country. And I feel like one of the things that Rosenwald and Washington shared was they were optimists.
Hmm.
They were both realists. They recognized problems. They knew they were out there, but they were hopeful. They were energetic and hopeful, and they felt that problems can be that people can solve problems, and people working together can do a great deal to change things.
Hmm.
And I think that's the message that I have taken from them, to not be discouraged, to things, this is the time they were dealing with was in many ways worse. Certainly the prejudice and the racial hostility back then was just grotesque.
Hmm.
But they persevered in the face of it, and the educational level for kids, Black kids, was very low, but they persevered, and they achieved. They
Hmm.
achieved what they set out to do.
Right.
So I think hope. I think hope. Um,
Thank you.
there's a lot we can take from their attitude.
Absolutely. Thank you. We will take hope. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for allowing us to walk in the shoes of Mr. Julius Rosenwald. It's been a pleasure to moderate your session with Kenneth Morris, who's coming up next month to talk about Booker T. Washington. So, everyone, stay tuned for part two of this story. Booker T. Washington, Kenneth Morris is the great grandson of Booker T. Washington and the great grandson of Frederick Douglass. And so that will be a story that will be told next month. Thank you all so much for being with us. It is 7:02. We are going to end our journey tonight. Thank you so much, Stephanie. If all, let's give her a round of applause and love for her
Thank
journey
you.
that she
Thank
is
you so
on.
much. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.